In 1971, a 15-year-old girl stepped into the Royal Melbourne Show. A crowded fairground packed with noise, lights, and thousands of witnesses. Within hours, she was simply gone. For her mother, that single afternoon became a 44-year question mark, one that refused to fade no matter how much time passed. How does a child disappear where disappearance should be impossible? Newport was still the sort of suburb where people believed they knew one another well enough to explain anything unusual that happened. Families lived in the same houses for decades, neighbors watched each other's children, and the rhythm of daily life rarely shifted far from what was expected. For the Milograd family, recent immigrants who had settled into the quiet routines of work, school, and community gatherings, it was a place where they finally felt stable after years of moving. Their youngest daughter, Tamara, was 15 that September, old enough to ask for a bit of independence, but still young enough that her mother worried over every small change in her behavior, even when she told herself it was simply part of growing up. On the morning of her disappearance, nothing stood out as unusual. Tamara left the house with the same light step she always had when she looked forward to something. The Royal Melbourne Show was a highlight for many teenagers, and she had been talking about it for weeks. She had ironed her favorite blouse the night before, and her mother had noticed how carefully she had packed the few coins she had saved for the day. There was no argument, no tension, no sign that Tamara was troubled or planning anything other than a simple, enjoyable outing with friends. Her mother later said she had even laughed over breakfast, an easy, relaxed sort of laugh she remembered vividly. Tamara met her friends as planned and traveled to the showgrounds by tram. According to the girls she went with, the group wandered together at first, visiting stalls and watching a display. At one point, though, as often happens with teenagers, they drifted apart. Some wanted to see the animals, others wanted to look at rides, and Tamara said she might go find a particular display she had heard about. Nothing in her tone or expression suggested she intended to be gone long. It was the kind of casual separation that happens 100 times in a crowded event, never drawing attention because it feels entirely normal. Back at the Milograd home, the day passed without concern. Tamara's mother prepared dinner, expecting her daughter to return around dusk, as she had promised. When the light began to fade, and the house settled into its familiar evening quiet, she started to check the window more often. At first, she told herself the trams might be delayed, or that Tamara might have been convinced to stay a little longer by her friends. But as each hour passed, the silence in the house changed. What had been a gentle waiting became a slightly sharper alertness, and by the time the sun was fully down, worry began to take shape. Her mother telephoned one of Tamara's friends, who confirmed that the group had indeed gone to the show, but explained that Tamara had separated from them sometime after lunch. The friend assumed she had gone to meet them again later, or had left early. No one imagined she might not return home at all. The mother hung up the phone with a feeling that something was off, though she could not yet describe it clearly. By late evening, the family began tracing the tram line that Tamara would have used, walking from stop to stop under the dim streetlights. They checked benches, waited near the platforms, and looked for anyone who might have seen a teenage girl traveling alone. They spoke to the station attendant and a group of boys who had been lingering near the kiosk, but no one remembered a girl matching her description. One boy did mention seeing a girl with long hair speaking to an older woman near the exit gate of the show earlier in the evening, but his memory was vague and uncertain. He had not paid attention. At the time, this detail felt too flimsy to mean anything, and it would later fade into the long list of things that might have mattered or might have been coincidences. Returning home close to midnight, Tamara's mother found herself fighting a tightening sense of dread. She sat in a chair near the front door, listening for footsteps on the path or the rattle of the gate. Every noise from outside made her straighten up, only for the hope to collapse again into silence. Her husband made more phone calls, first to relatives, then to neighbors still awake. No one had heard from Tamara or seen her. There were no signs of conflict at home, no arguments, no missing belongings, no hidden notes or diaries hinting at plans to leave. Tamara had not taken extra clothes, money, or personal items. Everything in her room remained exactly as it had been that morning. Her school books lay stacked neatly on the desk. The blouse she had ironed still draped over the back of a chair where she had left it before dressing, and her favorite necklace remained on its hook. Small details like these, the arrangement of familiar objects untouched, took on a heavy meaning as the hours passed. They suggested the absence was sudden, unplanned, and completely out of character. By the early hours of the morning, the family could no longer convince themselves that this was a misunderstanding that would clear by dawn. Tamara had never stayed out overnight without telling them. Her mother stood in the doorway of Tamara's room as the first gray light of morning began to seep in, and for the first time, she whispered the words that would stay with her for decades. "Something is wrong." When the police were contacted later that morning, they listened patiently but cautiously. In 1971, missing teenagers were often assumed to be runaways unless evidence suggested otherwise. The officers asked the routine questions about arguments at home, school performance, friendships, and boyfriends. Tamara's mother answered each one carefully, aware that every word mattered. She insisted that Tamara had no reason to leave voluntarily, but she also understood the difficulty of proving such a claim. In those first hours, the police could only note the basic facts. A 15-year-old girl attended a large public event, became separated from her friends, and did not return home. There were no signs of a struggle, no threats, no witnesses who could offer a concrete lead. The family felt the weight of uncertainty settle over them like a cold fog. They did not yet know that the coming days would bring no answers, and that the silence of this first night would grow into 3 long decades of unanswered questions. Tamara, at 13, taken at a family outing. She stared at the picture until her eyes blurred, trying to understand how a child she saw every day could simply vanish in the space of an afternoon. Above all, she kept returning to the same thought, that Tamara must be somewhere close, perhaps injured, perhaps waiting to be found. Hope, at that stage, was still stronger than fear. It would not stay that way for long. When the Milograd family contacted the police on the morning after Tamara failed to return home, they were not speaking to a system designed for rapid response missing person cases. It was 1971, an era before CCTV, before mobile phones, before digital databases or automated alerts. A missing teenager was not treated with the urgency that modern standards would demand. Officers arrived with paper notebooks, asked measured questions, and did their best within the boundaries of a very limited toolkit. Tamara's mother remembered the first visit vividly. The 2 officers who came to the house were polite and patient, but there was a restrained tone in everything they said. They asked when Tamara had been seen last, whether she had argued with anyone recently, whether she had shown signs of distress or rebellion, whether she might have run away. To the mother's ears, these questions felt almost accusatory, though she understood they were routine. She answered each carefully. No, there had been no argument. No, Tamara had not spoken of leaving home. No, she had no reason to disappear. Yet she knew that without concrete evidence of danger, the police could not assume the worst. The officers made notes and told the family they would begin inquiries at the showgrounds and along public transport routes. It would take time. Everything in 1971 took time. Information was gathered in person, not electronically. Witnesses had to be found by walking streets and knocking on doors. Reports were typed manually and filed in cabinets where they would sit until someone physically pulled them out again. That same afternoon, police officers returned to the Royal Melbourne show to retrace possible movements. They spoke with gate attendants who remembered waves, of teenagers coming and going, but could not single out one girl among thousands. They checked lost and found stations, first aid tents, and small security posts scattered through the grounds. Tamara had not been brought in for injury and had not approached anyone for help. One attendant recalled seeing a quiet-looking girl who resembled Tamara leaving the fair just before dusk, but the memory was uncertain. It was impossible to know if he had truly seen her or if he was simply trying to be helpful. Officers also checked the train station adjacent to the show, speaking to staff and commuters. A station worker thought he might have seen a teenage girl buy a ticket heading toward a small country town. But in that era, tickets were simple paper slips handed out without names or timestamps. Without a receipt or a matching witness, the information hung in the air without weight. It could have been Tamara or someone entirely unrelated. Back in Newport, the family widened their own search, moving from home to home asking neighbors if Tamara had been seen. Her mother walked the familiar streets with Tamara's photograph in hand, knocking on doors with the quiet determination of someone refusing to accept uncertainty. The responses were sympathetic, but unhelpful. One older woman said she remembered seeing a girl in a blue blouse walking quickly near the station, though she could not be sure of the time. Another neighbor recalled hearing teenagers talking loudly in the park that evening, but none matched Tamara's description. Every conversation offered a flicker of possibility that went nowhere. By the end of the second day, the family and police had established a rough timeline of where Tamara had been, but not where she had gone. She had entered the showgrounds, separated from her friends, and then seemed to dissolve into the crowd. There was no sign of a crime scene, no abandoned belongings, no clear direction of travel. Without witnesses or physical clues, the police faced a long, open-ended task, searching without knowing what they were searching for. As the days passed, officers visited hospitals and shelters throughout Melbourne. They checked casualty lists, admission logs, and reports of unidentified young women. Nothing matched Tamara. Her mother visited some of these places herself, despite the distress it caused her. She walked through hospital corridors, glancing into waiting rooms, hoping to see her daughter sitting alone, waiting to be recognized. She returned home each time with the same hollow feeling. Police also interviewed Tamara's teachers and classmates, looking for cues about her relationships or state of mind. Almost everyone described her the same way. Quiet, friendly, respectful, not the kind of girl who would run away. Her friends insisted they had no argument with her at the show. Her teachers noted she had been performing well in school, with no sign of trouble. Every conversation reinforced the same point. If Tamara had left voluntarily, it was for reasons no one understood. As the first week ended, the limitations of the era became painful. Posters were printed and distributed by hand. Newspapers wrote brief notices about the missing girl, buried between local announcements and sports updates. There was no internet to broadcast her image, no social media to alert thousands instantly. The police did what they could with the tools they had, but for the family, the search felt slow and incomplete. Not through lack of effort, but through the nature of the time. A small twist came on the 9th day, when a young boy reported seeing a girl who looked like Tamara leaving the showgrounds with an older woman. His description was unclear, and when questioned further, he contradicted himself twice. The police added the note to the file, but admitted privately to the family that the testimony was unreliable. Still, it lingered in Tamara's mother's mind, the faint, troubling image of her daughter walking with someone she did not know. Another lead emerged when a woman in a nearby suburb claimed she had seen a distressed teenage girl outside a chemist on the evening of the show. But when officers visited and asked her to look at Tamara's photograph, she hesitated and said she could no longer be sure. The moment dissolved into uncertainty like the others. By the end of the second week, the investigation had no firm direction. The police reassured the family that they were continuing to look, but in reality, the momentum was slowing. Without new information, the case had begun to drift toward that quiet, uncomfortable category that families dread. A disappearance, without clues. Tamara's mother felt the weight of those early days settle inside her. She sat at the kitchen table late into the evenings, running her finger along the rim of Tamara's teacup, imagining her daughter returning to the house cold and tired, needing warmth and comfort. She tried to picture possible explanations: an accident, confusion, a moment of panic, or the remote possibility that Tamara had chosen to leave. None of these images felt right. All she knew, with a certainty that pressed on her chest, was that the girl she had raised so carefully could not simply vanish without reason. And yet, that was exactly what had happened. As the second week closed, the police told the family honestly that the lack of evidence was becoming a barrier. They would continue searching, but the case had not revealed a clear starting point. Tamara's mother listened quietly, understanding that a turning point had come. The first days of frantic possibility were ending, and a longer, more painful phase was beginning. The phase where hope had to be kept alive, without any new reason to believe. As the first weeks turned into months, the disappearance of Tamara Milograd began to settle into the kind of silence that families fear most. At the beginning, people in Newport still asked about her. Neighbors stopped by with meals, classmates left cards, and parish friends offered prayers and small gestures of comfort. But as time passed without new information, the rhythm of community life resumed, and those conversations, once frequent and urgent, became occasional, then rare. For the Milograds, however, life did not return to normal. Their days revolved around the absence that hung in the air like something visible but untouchable. Financially, the family struggled. Tamara's father reduced his working hours so he could participate in searches and follow any lead offered by strangers, no matter how faint. Her mother, already juggling household responsibilities, took on extra work to replace the income being lost. They made careful calculations at the end of each week: what bills could wait, what expenses could be trimmed, which repairs could be ignored. The cost of printing posters, traveling to nearby towns, and phoning organizations for information added up, slowly tightening the frame around their daily life. But her mother rarely spoke of this burden. She viewed every dollar spent on the search as necessary, even if it meant stretching meals or postponing essential needs. Emotionally, the home changed in ways that were subtle at first, but unmistakable to anyone who spent time there. Tamara's room remained untouched. Her mother made the bed each morning, smoothing the sheets as though her daughter might return and step into the room without warning. The house fell quieter. Conversations shortened. Laughter became rare. The younger children, Tamara's siblings, absorbed the tension but did not know how to express their confusion. At school, teachers noticed their distraction and occasional withdrawal, but there were no clear answers to offer or solutions to suggest. The police investigation continued during those early months, though without the intensity of the first 2 weeks. Officers followed up on reported sightings, most of which turned out to be unrelated girls seen at bus stops or shopping centers. Each time a call came, the family felt a moment of cautious hope, but nearly every lead ended in disappointment. One report suggested Tamara had been seen traveling toward Ballarat. Another placed a girl resembling her at a beach town. A third claimed she had been heard speaking with a group of teenagers near a train station. None could be confirmed. None offered progress. Still, the Milogrades continued searching on their own. The mother made regular trips to Melbourne, carrying a small envelope of photographs to show shopkeepers, tram drivers, and hotel attendants. Most looked politely, shaking their heads. A few suggested contacting interstate police. Some offered to display her photo in a window. She returned home tired each evening, holding tightly to the belief that persistence was the only tool she had left. One minor twist emerged during the second year. A woman from a rural town claimed she had once rented a room to a girl, using the name Tammy, who resembled the missing posters. She described a shy young teenager who kept to herself, but her memory was vague, and the dates did not align cleanly. Police visited the town, spoke to neighbors, and reviewed what little information existed. No documents, no travel records, no corroborating witnesses. The lead dissolved quietly, absorbed into the file like all the others. The years accumulated. Anniversaries passed quietly. Birthdays went uncelebrated except for a candle her mother lit in the kitchen window. Newer neighbors moved into the street and did not know the story unless someone told them. Teachers who had once taught Tamara retired or moved on. Even the Royal Melbourne Show, the place where she was last seen, continued year after year without any visible connection to the girl who had walked through its gates and then disappeared. By the 10th year, the investigation had been formally reclassified as inactive, a term used by police to indicate that no new leads existed and no further action could be taken unless fresh information emerged. To her mother, the word felt clinical, almost dismissive. But she also knew that the file being inactive did not mean Tamara was forgotten. It simply meant the system had reached its limit, and whatever answers remained would not come from official channels. For the Milograd family, the disappearance gradually shifted from a daily crisis to a constant background presence. It shaped their thoughts, decisions, and relationships. It hung over family gatherings, influencing every conversation without needing to be spoken aloud. It taught them to live in a state of suspended grief, where one part of the mind accepts the possibility of loss, while another part refuses to let go of hope. Yet, even in that long, quiet stretch of years, there were moments when Tamara's mother felt a strange form of strength. She kept a small envelope tucked in a drawer containing her daughter's birth certificate, a few childhood photos, and a lock of baby hair. She told herself that someday, somehow, someone might need these things. They were proof that Tamara had lived, had been loved, and had belonged somewhere. She believed that as long as she kept these memories intact, Tamara's story was not entirely closed. What she did not know, and could not know, was that the answer to the mystery had already been written far from Melbourne, under a different name, in a different town, and in a life her daughter never spoke of to anyone. And although decades still stood between the disappearance and the truth, the chain of events that would eventually bring clarity was already in motion. A single photograph on a national database, a hunch from a woman seeking her own origins, and the persistence of a mother who had refused to forget. The case was growing colder by the year, but the story was not finished. Time does not move evenly for families of the missing. For the Milogrades, the years after Tamara vanished did not unfold as a simple sequence of seasons. Instead, they became a long, uneven stretch made of small routines, repeated questions, and quiet attempts to live around a void that never stopped reminding them of its presence. The world outside their home changed with each passing decade. Inside, however, the disappearance remained a fixed point, unchanged, unanswered, and unresolved. In the first 5 years, Tamara's mother held firmly to the belief that her daughter might still return. She did not imagine a dramatic reunion or a sudden revelation. She pictured simpler, quieter possibilities. Perhaps Tamara had suffered a head injury and lost her memory. Perhaps she had been taken in by someone who believed she needed help. Perhaps she was living somewhere unaware of the search behind her. These thoughts were not based on evidence, but on the instinct of a parent who refuses to accept the worst without proof. Every time the phone rang, her mother listened closely to the voice on the other end, hoping for a familiar tone that never came. Even as hope persisted, life demanded practical adjustments. Siblings grew older, schools changed, and responsibilities shifted. The parents learned to navigate birthdays and holidays with care, not ignoring Tamara, but not letting the absence overwhelm every occasion either. They placed a small photograph of her near the dining table, a quiet symbol that she was still considered part of the family, even if only in memory. As the second decade approached, a soft but unmistakable change took root. Hope did not disappear, but it became quieter, less urgent. Tamara's mother no longer checked the mailbox each morning expecting a breakthrough. She no longer looked for her daughter's face in every crowd she passed. Instead, her hope became something gentler, something less tied to the idea of return and more connected to a wish that Tamara had at least known some measure of peace after leaving home. The human mind reshapes grief in order to survive it, and over time, the mother's thoughts shifted from wondering where her daughter was to wondering who she had become before the silence took her away. The police file, once active and frequently updated, settled into the archives of the Missing Persons Unit. Officers retired, transferred, or moved on to other roles. New recruits occasionally reviewed old cases, but without fresh information, the reports stayed in their folders, unchanged. The system had no malice. It simply had limits. Missing persons cases from the 1970s faced particular challenges: incomplete records, lack of physical evidence, and the absence of the digital tools that modern investigators rely on. Without a body, a confession, or a reliable witness, the disappearance could not move in any direction. During these years, Tamara's mother aged quietly. Her once busy hands slowed, her steps shortened, and her days became more structured, shaped by small routines that helped her manage the weight she still carried. She learned to take comfort in familiar tasks: tending the small garden behind the house, writing letters to relatives overseas, preparing recipes her daughter had once enjoyed. These tasks did not erase the ache of not knowing, but they offered a way to keep moving, one day at a time. The family never stopped acknowledging Tamara. When her siblings reached milestones, graduations, marriages, children of their own, there was always a brief pause in each celebration, a moment where someone quietly said how much Tamara would have enjoyed being present. Her mother often wondered what kind of adult her daughter might have been. Would she have pursued university, found work she loved, married, or had children? These thoughts were not painful in themselves. What hurt was the uncertainty that surrounded them, the knowledge that she would never have answers to even the simplest questions. Now and then, small incidents reignited a glimmer of possibility. A neighbor might mention seeing a woman who resembled Tamara at a market. An article about unidentified bodies found decades earlier might surface in a newspaper. A television program about cold cases might trigger a memory of some detail long forgotten. Each time, Tamara's mother felt a familiar tightening in her chest, the echo of a hope that refused to disappear entirely, even after decades. But every lead ended the same way, without confirmation, without closure. By the time the fourth decade approached, acceptance had taken a different shape. It was not surrender. It was the recognition that life had to continue, even without clarity. The mother no longer spoke of Tamara daily, but her daughter remained woven into her thoughts. She kept a small wooden box containing Tamara's childhood keepsakes: a few letters, tiny drawings, a button from a school uniform. She opened the box only occasionally, usually on quiet afternoons when she sat by the window watching the light change. These were moments of remembrance, not despair. Her greatest fear had always been forgetting. But she never did. Even as her memory of certain years blurred, her recollection of Tamara's voice, smile, and mannerisms remained precise. She could still describe the exact way her daughter brushed her hair behind her ear when she felt shy, the sound of her footsteps on the hallway floorboards, and the expression she wore when concentrating on schoolwork. These details lived inside her, as though fixed in time. Meanwhile, the world outside continued to modernize. DNA technology advanced, national databases expanded, genealogical services became available to the public. None of these developments seemed connected to the old disappearance from 1971. Yet the quiet progress of science, occurring far beyond the family's awareness, was laying the groundwork for something none of them could have predicted. Tamara's mother often said that her greatest wish before leaving this world was simple: to know what had happened. Not necessarily to reunite. After so many years, she understood that might no longer be possible, but to understand her daughter's story to its end. She did not need dramatic revelations or complete explanations. She simply wanted the unanswered question to finally have a shape. For decades, she believed she would never receive that gift. She had made peace with the idea that Tamara's fate would remain locked in the past, out of reach. But in early 2015, as the mother approached her 90s, the story of Tamara Milograd, quiet, unsolved, nearly forgotten by everyone except her family, was about to shift for the first time in 44 years. And the change began, unexpectedly, not with a witness or a confession, but with a photograph on a government website seen by someone who had never even heard the name Tamara Milograd. By the time she reached her 90s, the grandmother had learned to live with the kind of quiet that only long sorrow can produce. Her days were organized around small routines: watering the plants near the window, making tea at the same hour each afternoon, reading the newspaper slowly, line by line. She did not expect the world to return Tamara to her. She no longer looked for her daughter in crowds or paused at the sight of young women on the street. The years had taught her restraint, and the ache had settled into something manageable, though never absent. She still lived in the same modest home in Newport, the same place where Tamara had grown up. The neighborhood had changed around her. Children she once knew had become adults and moved away. Houses had been renovated or replaced. The local shopkeeper who once posted Tamara's missing flyer in his window had retired years ago. But the grandmother remained, carrying her memories quietly, without asking the world to remember alongside her. Then, early in 2015, something happened that broke the familiar pattern of her days. It was a Tuesday morning, a detail she later recalled not because of its significance, but because of its ordinariness. She had just finished preparing a cup of tea when she heard a firm but civil knock at the door. Her first thought was that it must be a neighbor, as unexpected visitors were rare. She walked slowly to the entrance, opened the door, and found 2 police officers standing on the front step. For a moment, she could not speak. Police visits were something she associated with the first years after Tamara vanished, not with the quiet of her old age. The younger officer introduced himself and his colleague, explaining they were part of a team that reviewed historical missing person cases. Their demeanor was calm, respectful, and deliberate. They did not enter the house immediately. They waited for her invitation, sensing the weight of the moment. When she guided them inside and settled into her chair, she noticed how differently she felt compared to the early years. In her 40s, police visits had filled her with urgent hope and fear. Now, at 90, she felt something quieter, apprehension mixed with a fragile readiness to hear whatever they had come to say. She had lived too long with the unknown to be easily disturbed, yet she knew that the presence of the officers must mean something. The older of the two spoke first, choosing his words carefully. "Mrs. Milograd," he said, "we're here regarding your daughter, Tamara." She nodded silently, gripping the armrest of her chair. It had been many years since anyone outside the family had spoken Tamara's name aloud in her presence. The officer continued with professional steadiness. "We want to inform you that we have recently received new information that may be relevant to the case." Her breath caught, but she did not allow herself to react strongly. Experience had taught her that new information could mean almost anything: an unverified sighting, a recovered item with no proven connection, or something as simple as a record misfiled decades earlier. She held her composure, waiting for the next sentence. The officers exchanged a glance, one of those subtle signals that indicated they were proceeding cautiously. "At this stage," the younger one added, "we cannot say more until we verify certain details, but we would like your permission to take another look at the materials you still have. Photographs, personal items, anything from Tamara's childhood. Advances in our identification methods mean that older cases can sometimes benefit from renewed examination." Even in her 90s, the grandmother was perceptive. She understood immediately that the officers were being intentionally vague. They were not promising answers. They were not suggesting closure. They were simply acknowledging that something had surfaced, something that required confirmation before they could speak plainly. And she respected that restraint. After 44 years of hoping and hurting, she wanted facts, not possibilities. She stood slowly, walked to her bedroom, and opened a drawer that she had kept undisturbed for decades. Inside was a small box that held the fragments of Tamara's early life. A lock of baby hair, a childhood photo, a school ribbon, a few letters she had written to friends. She handed the box to the officers with steady hands. While one officer catalogued the items, the other asked if she still had Tamara's old hairbrush. The grandmother nodded, retrieved it, and placed it gently on the table. She watched as they placed it into a protective sleeve. There was something surreal in seeing ordinary objects, things she had kept for memory, suddenly treated with forensic importance. When they prepared to leave, the grandmother asked the question she had managed to hold back until that moment. "Is this about finding remains?" Her voice did not waver. After decades of uncertainty, she had learned to face every possibility. The older officer hesitated before answering, but he did not lie. "We're not prepared to draw conclusions, ma'am," he said carefully. "We simply believe a re-examination is warranted." It was not reassurance, but it was honesty, and she appreciated that. After they left, she sat alone in the quiet of her home. She felt neither hope nor despair, but a subtle tightening in her chest, a sense that something was shifting, though she did not know in which direction. She told herself not to expect anything. She had lived long enough to know that new information could easily collapse under scrutiny, but she did allow herself one rare thought as she sipped her tea slowly. At least someone is still looking. That night, for the first time in years, she slept more deeply than usual, not because she believed the mystery was close to being solved, but because she knew the file bearing her daughter's name had been opened again after decades in the dark. She could not know that the officer's caution was not merely professional restraint. They had already received a message from someone who claimed to have a personal connection to a woman whose identity did not fully align with the records. It was not yet confirmed, and so they had not spoken of it. But for the first time in 44 years, the silence surrounding Tamara's disappearance was beginning to crack, and the grandmother, without realizing it, had stepped one small but decisive step closer to the truth. It was less than 2 weeks after the officers visited when the phone rang again. The grandmother was sitting near the window, sorting through letters and small notes, when she heard the familiar sound. Over the years, she had trained herself to answer every call calmly, without expectation, because so many past calls had offered nothing but routine inquiries or administrative updates. But this time, before she even lifted the receiver, she felt the faintest tension run through her body, something quiet, instinctive, and difficult to explain. The voice on the other end belonged to the senior officer who had visited her home. He spoke with that same careful steadiness she remembered, but there was a different cadence now, as though he was speaking from a place of increased responsibility. "Mrs. Milograd," he began, "we've made progress in the review of your daughter's case. Would you be available for us to visit again? We'd like to speak in person." She agreed immediately. Her hand trembled slightly as she placed the receiver back in its cradle. A part of her wanted to dismiss the significance of the call. Experience had conditioned her to be cautious, but she could not entirely silence the quiet intuition telling her that this visit was different. The officers arrived the following morning. This time they did not stand at the threshold waiting for an invitation. They stepped inside with the kind of gravity that people carry when they know their words may affect the rest of someone's life. The grandmother sat down, her hands folded in her lap. She noticed that the younger officer held a file that was much thicker than the one she had seen during their first visit. He placed it gently on the table in front of them, not opening it yet. The senior officer leaned forward slightly, choosing his words as though each carried weight. "Mrs. Milograd," he said, "the items you provided were extremely helpful. We conducted a DNA comparison using newer techniques that weren't available in earlier decades. The results have identified a familial connection we believe you should know about." She felt her breath slow, but did not interrupt. She listened with the same disciplined patience she had learned over 44 years. The officer continued, "A woman recently contacted authorities with questions about her own family history. She submitted a DNA sample through an identification program, hoping to learn more about her mother, who passed away when she was very young. When her sample entered the system, it showed a close genetic match to the materials we collected from you." The grandmother frowned slightly, trying to understand. The officer paused only long enough to give her space, then clarified. "The match indicates a direct biological relationship. Specifically, this woman appears to be your granddaughter." For a moment, the room felt still, as though even the air paused to absorb the meaning of the words. The grandmother blinked slowly, processing the information with the care of someone who has been trained by life not to accept anything hastily. "My granddaughter?" she repeated, not in disbelief, but in precise confirmation, as though she needed to hear the term again to form a bridge between the decades of silence and the sudden presence of a new life connected to her family. "Yes," the officer said gently. "Her name is Karina Russell." The younger officer then opened the file and slid forward a page with printed information, stopping short of revealing photographs. "She is an adult now," he explained, "and she has been searching for information about her biological mother for several years." The grandmother's hands tightened on her knees. Her next question came not with urgency, but with clarity. "And her mother?" The answer came with measured solemnity. "Her mother was known as Pauline Tammy Russell, but based on our findings and the DNA sample, there is no doubt that she was, in fact, your daughter, Tamara." The words arrived not as a shock, but as a quiet, heavy truth settling into a space that had been empty for nearly half a century. The grandmother did not cry or exclaim. She simply closed her eyes and inhaled slowly, as though rearranging the shape of her thoughts around this new reality. She asked the next question calmly. "Is she still alive?" The answer was gentle but firm. No, she passed away in a car accident in 1976. The grandmother absorbed the information with the same composure she had shown throughout the conversation, but the officers could see the subtle shift in her expression, a kind of soft collapse that happens not from sudden grief, but from the quiet confirmation of a truth long feared and long delayed. She looked down at her hands for a moment before speaking. So she lived, and she had children, and we never knew. The younger officer nodded. It appears she left Melbourne shortly after her disappearance. She traveled under a slightly altered identity, changed her birth year, and settled in regional Victoria. We have reason to believe she lived a quiet life and kept her background private. There is no evidence of harm or coercion. It seems she chose a new path for reasons we may never fully understand. Tamara's mother nodded slowly, accepting that some parts of her daughter's story would remain out of reach. But other parts, her daughter working, growing, becoming a mother, were details she had never dared to imagine, and now they felt both comforting and heartbreaking. The officers continued. Karina, your granddaughter, didn't know the truth either. She only knew the name Pauline. She was raised briefly by relatives after her mother's death. Later, when she grew older, she began searching for information. When she saw a photograph of a missing girl on a national database that resembled her mother, she felt a strong instinct that something was connected. That is what brought her to us. The grandmother sat quietly, her thoughts forming slowly and carefully. Then she asked the question that had hovered unspoken between them. Does she want to meet me? Yes, the officer said. Very much. With your permission, we can arrange it. The grandmother looked toward the window, watching the sunlight shift across the floor. It was a small, ordinary gesture, but it carried the weight of someone considering a life-changing decision. When she finally spoke, her voice carried an unexpected steadiness. Yes, she said. I would like that. The officers remained with her for a while longer, answering her questions. How Tamara had lived, where she had been, what little they knew of the years between her disappearance and her death. They did not pretend to have all the answers. Some parts of the past were simply unreachable. But for the first time since 1971, the grandmother's understanding of her daughter's fate was no longer defined by guesswork. She had facts, however incomplete. She had truth, however bittersweet. And she had something else, a connection to the next generation her daughter had left behind. When the officers finally stood to leave, the grandmother reached for the small wooden box containing Tamara's keepsakes. She held it for a moment, then placed it gently on the table. For 44 years, she said quietly, I thought I would die without ever knowing anything. She closed the lid softly. But now I know where her story went. That night when she lay down to sleep, she did not fall asleep quickly. But for the first time in many years, the uncertainty that had lived inside her was no longer an open wound. It had found a shape, not a complete answer, but a path. And waiting along that path was the granddaughter she had never known existed. The reunion was arranged to take place in the grandmother's own living room, a place she knew well, a space where she felt steady on her feet. At 90, she no longer ventured far, and the officers felt it was better for everyone if the young woman came to her. The house was quiet that afternoon, curtains slightly open to let in a soft light. The grandmother sat in her usual armchair, hands resting calmly on her lap, waiting for a knock she had once thought would never come. When the door finally opened and Karina stepped inside, guided by an officer, the grandmother felt a faint jolt of recognition, subtle but unmistakable. There was something in the young woman's posture, the way she held her gaze, that stirred a memory she had kept locked away for decades. Karina looked hesitant at first, her hand gripping a small envelope as though afraid to let go. "Mrs. Milograd," she said gently. "You may call me what feels comfortable," the grandmother replied, her voice steady. Karina walked closer and took a seat across from her. For a moment, they simply observed one another. Two strangers connected by a woman neither could fully bring back, yet both deeply remembered in their own way. Karina finally reached into her envelope and placed a worn photograph on the table between them. "This is my mum, Pauline," she said. The grandmother leaned forward slowly, adjusting her glasses. When she saw the photograph, she inhaled softly. "That's Tamara's smile," she murmured. "Not dramatic, not overwhelmed, just certain." Karina swallowed, her voice unsteady. "I never knew she had a family. I never knew why she never spoke about her past. And I never knew she became a mother," the grandmother answered. Her words carried no resentment, only the tired acceptance of someone who had waited a lifetime for the smallest pieces of truth. Karina asked what Tamara had been like growing up, and the grandmother answered in calm, detailed memories. How Tamara tied her hair back when she concentrated. How she kept small notebooks filled with doodles. How she liked to help in the garden but always forgot her gloves. These were small recollections, but they were the first real fragments of her mother's life Karina had ever heard. In exchange, Karina described the woman she knew. Quiet, private, hard-working, gentle with her children. The grandmother listened closely, quietly absorbing each detail of the years she had been denied. There was no attempt to explain why Tamara left in 1971 or why she never returned. Both women understood those answers were gone. What mattered now was the connection that remained. Before leaving, Karina reached out and touched the grandmother's hand lightly. "Thank you," she said. "I didn't expect... family?" "You've always had one," the grandmother answered. "You simply didn't know where to find us." The meeting ended without ceremony. No raised voices, no tears, no dramatic gestures, only a quiet understanding settling between them. After 44 years, the grandmother finally knew what had become of her daughter. Not every detail, not every reason, but enough. That evening, sitting alone in her armchair, she whispered to herself with a calm she had not felt in decades. She lived. She truly lived. And a part of her found its way back. If you found this story compelling, remember to subscribe so you don't miss the next case we uncover. And before you go, where are you watching from? I'd love to know.